There were 2 lines on that note. Just 2. Written in blue pen on the back of a hardware store receipt, folded once, and set on the kitchen island where she'd find it with her first cup of coffee. The first line she understood immediately. I know that because she called me 41 times in the 6 hours that followed. The second line she didn't understand at all. She thought it was nothing. A grocery reminder. Some small, petty dig from a man on his way out the door. It took her 11 months to work out what that second line actually meant. And when she finally did, she was sitting alone in a $612,000 house she had fought me tooth and nail to keep, and she understood, at last, that she had struck the match herself. My name's Elias. Everybody's called me Eli since about the 6th grade. I'm 54 years old, and for 31 of those years I've done the same work. I inspect structures that failed, and I write down why. Parking garages. Pedestrian bridges. A church balcony in Ashland that sagged 4 inches over a decade, and nobody noticed until the choir stood up. So, here's the thing about my job that most people get wrong. Buildings don't collapse all at once. That's television. What actually happens is a slow, quiet, invisible failure. A hairline crack, a little water, one bolt carrying a load it was never designed to carry for years. And then, one Tuesday, all at once. I knew that about concrete. I did not know it about my own marriage. 26 years, and I never once thought to inspect it. Corinne and I bought the house on Hollis Ridge Road in 1999 with a down payment we scraped together from her design commissions and my overtime. It had orange shag carpet and a furnace that sounded like a man clearing his throat. She stood in that ugly living room, spun around once with her arms out, and told me she could see the whole rest of our lives in it. I believed her. I still do, honestly. That part was never a lie. She's an interior designer, the real kind, not the throw pillow kind. She can walk into a room and tell you within 4 seconds what's wrong with it. She rebuilt that house piece by piece over 20 years, and by the end, people used to slow their cars down out front. There's a fig tree in the south window she has kept alive since our son Owen was in kindergarten. Owen's 26 now, an EMT down in Cincinnati, and the pencil marks tracking his height are still on the doorframe of the pantry because neither of us would ever let a painter touch them. And I want to be straight with you about something because it matters later. I am not an exciting man. I keep every receipt. I log my mileage. I've had the same barber for 19 years and the same order at the same diner since 2004. Black coffee, no sugar, and I count the seconds before somebody answers a question. That's a habit from depositions. Under 2 seconds is a person telling you what they know. Over 3 seconds is a person deciding what to tell you. Corinne used to call me the human filing cabinet. She meant it kindly. Mostly. March 14th was a Tuesday. I was supposed to be in Pittsburgh until Thursday afternoon, sitting through a code compliance review on a mixed-use build that had already burned through 2 engineers before me. I did something that morning in that hotel room that I have never told another living soul. I'll get to it. It's the whole reason any of this ends the way it does. But the short version is this. At 9:40 in the morning, I put a signed document in a manila envelope, walked it down to the front desk, and asked the kid there to hold it for me. Then I checked out 2 days early, put my bag in the truck, a 2014 Tundra with 188,000 miles on it, and started driving home. Real quick, before I go any further, if this story's pulling you in, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and give the video a like. It helps more than you'd think. So, 4 hours of highway. I stopped at a Sunoco outside Zanesville, bought 2 coffees, and put one in the cup holder for her, because that's a thing we did. Whoever is driving home buys 2. And about 90 minutes out, I did something I'd done maybe 6 times in 5 years. I opened the location app on my phone. We'd set that thing up back when Owen got his license. 3 little icons on a map. Him, her, me. Owen turned his off the day he moved out. Corinne and I never bothered. It had just sat there for years, like a smoke detector nobody thinks about. I wasn't checking on her. I want to be clear about that, because I'd had a long time to be honest with myself, and that's the honest version. I was checking whether she was home, so I'd know if I had time to stop and pick up flowers before she got back. That's it. That's the whole reason. Her pin wasn't on Hollis Ridge. It was 38 minutes northwest on Route 9, sitting on a strip of road I've driven 1,000 times. Nothing out there but a farm supply, a shuttered ice cream stand, and the Larkspur Inn, one of those long, low motor lodges from the 60s with a gravel lot and a sign that still says color TV. My first thought was a client. She takes meetings all over the county. My second thought was that the app was wrong. It drifts sometimes. So I did what I do. I pulled into the lot of a closed garden center, put the truck in park, and I waited. Because I don't guess. I document. I sat there for 2 hours and 11 minutes. I watched that little blue dot the whole time. It never moved once. I want to tell you, I felt rage. I've read the comments people leave on stories like this. I'd have kicked the door in, I'd have made a scene. And maybe you would have, but that's not what happened in that truck. What I felt was quiet. A very specific, very cold kind of quiet, like the air right before a load-bearing wall gives. My hands were steady on the wheel. The second coffee was still in the cup holder, going cold, with her name written on the side in marker. At 3002, the dot moved. It went south on Route 9. It stopped at the Kroger on 5th for 19 minutes. Then it went home. I didn't follow it. I drove to the Blue Cardinal on Route 9, same diner, same booth, same black coffee, and I sat there until dark while Denise refilled my cup 3 times without asking a single question. God bless her. Here's where I want your opinion, honestly. Because most men would have driven straight to that motel and made a scene. I didn't. If you'd been sitting in that truck, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. Around 8 o'clock I paid my check, left a 5, and drove back to Pittsburgh. 3.5 hours in the opposite direction, to a hotel I had already checked out of, and I paid for 2 more nights so that when I walked in that door on Thursday, my story would be true. She made pork chops that Thursday. She bought a new tablecloth. She asked me how Pittsburgh was, and she leaned across the counter and kissed my cheek, and I counted the seconds before she asked. It was 1. Just 1. She wasn't nervous at all. And that's when I understood the thing that actually broke me. It wasn't the motel. A man can survive a motel. It was that she wasn't nervous, which meant this wasn't the hard part for her. This was the easy practice part. So that night, while she slept, I sat at the kitchen island with my phone and opened that app again, and I found the setting I'd never had a reason to look at before. The one that keeps 30 days of location history. And I scrolled back. March 14th wasn't the first time. It wasn't even close. 30 days. That's all the app keeps. 30 days, and inside those 30 days, that motel showed up 6 separate times. 6. Always a Tuesday or a Thursday. Always between 12:40 and 35:10 in the afternoon, which is the exact window Corinne blocks off on her calendar for what she calls site walks, the hours when a designer drives around checking somebody's tile order or arguing with a cabinet guy. Nobody questions where a designer is between noon and 3. That's the whole beauty of it. I sat on that stool at the island until 4,000 in the morning with the fridge humming and her asleep upstairs, and I did not cry. I want to say I did, because it would make me sound like a better man. What I did was get out a legal pad. Look, I've spent 31 years being handed a pile of wreckage and being asked to explain how it got that way. And there's only one method that works. You don't start with a theory. You start with a timeline. Dates in the left column, evidence in the right, and you don't write a single word in the right column that you can't prove. So that's what I built. At the top of the page, I wrote March 14, and underneath it, I wrote every one of those 6 days, with the arrival time, the departure time, and the coordinates. Then I photographed every screen on that app with my work phone, because I knew the app would roll those days off in a matter of weeks and pretend they never happened. And here's the part I'm not proud of. When I finished, I felt calm. Not good. Not right. Calm, the way you feel when the noise in your head finally has a shape. I went up at 5, got in bed beside her, and she rolled over and put her cold foot against my leg the way she has done for 26 years. She didn't wake up. I lay there until the light came in through the blinds, and honestly, I thought about the fig tree in the south window. about how she'd wrapped it in a moving blanket during the ice storm in 14 and sat with it in the dark like it was a sick kid. That's what I couldn't square. She wasn't a cruel woman. She had never once in her life been a cruel woman. And that made all of this so much worse because it meant I wasn't dealing with a stranger. I was dealing with somebody I loved who had decided I was survivable. Owen called that Saturday. He'd pulled a double, and he was doing that thing where he talks fast to hide how tired he is. Corinne got on the phone and laughed at something he said, and she looked over at me while she was laughing and rolled her eyes, and I smiled back. 26 years builds a lot of muscle memory. I smiled back, and I meant it. That's the part nobody warns you about. Quick thing, if you're still with me and the story's got a hold of you, hit subscribe and drop a like. It genuinely makes a difference for a small channel like mine. Alright. So Monday I went to the office, closed my door, and pulled 18 months of statements. Not to snoop, to build the right column. Now, we've always kept a joint card and separate business cards. Mine's an old Visa I use for job sites and hotels. Hers runs through her design LLC, and I never touched it, because it was hers and because I trusted her and because I am, as she once put it, a filing cabinet. I file, I don't rummage. But every card in that house feeds into one tax return. And I do the taxes. So I sat there with 18 months of her LLC statements, and I read them the way I'd read a strain gauge log. And most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Fabric wholesalers in High Point. A lighting rep in Columbus. $400 a month at a print shop for renderings. And then a line item that stopped me cold. $89. Every single month. A place called Ridgeway Self-Storage out on the county line, billed as Studio Overflow. Here's the problem with that. Corinne has never had Studio Overflow. Her studio is the converted garage on the east side of our house, and there is a whole 800 square foot loft above it that has been half empty since 2011. I know, because I framed the stairs to it myself. She was paying $89 a month to store something 40 minutes from a building with an empty floor in it. I didn't drive out there. Not then. I wrote it in the right column, and I let it sit, and I'll be straight with you. That unit stayed in the back of my head like a stone in a boot for weeks. What I did instead was something small and boring, and it turned out to be the single most important thing I did in this entire story. 2 years back, when Corinne got a new tablet, I set the old one up in my workshop so I could pull up drawings out there without hauling my laptop through the sawdust. It was still signed into her account. It had been sitting on the shelf above my bench for 22 months, plugged in, syncing, and neither one of us had thought about it once. I turned it on that Wednesday night, and the messages loaded. Not 30 days of them. All of them. I read for 4 hours in a cold garage with a space heater at my feet, and I have not been the same man since. The thread started in October of the year before last. 17 months. Not a slip, not a weeknight, not a mistake at a conference. 17 months of somebody good morning-ing my wife before I was out of the shower. There were hundreds of them. Photos of a lake. An inside joke about a song. Her telling him what she was making for dinner, for my dinner in my kitchen, and him saying it sounded good. And then, on a Thursday in February, 6 weeks before I ever opened that map, she wrote him this. He measures things. He doesn't actually see them. I read that line probably 40 times. I read it until the space heater clicked off and the garage went cold. Because, you know what? She wasn't wrong. That's the thing that gutted me. She wasn't being vicious, she was being accurate, and she'd said it to somebody else because she'd stopped believing she could say it to me. Nothing falls all at once. Not a balcony, not a bridge, not a marriage. There's always a hairline crack somewhere, years before, that somebody looked straight at and decided was cosmetic. So I stopped treating, and I went inside, and I made a decision that I did not change one single time over the next 11 months. I was not going to confront her. Not in the kitchen, not on the stairs, not with the tablet in my hand. Because I've sat through enough depositions to know exactly what a confrontation buys you. It buys you one bad night, an apology, a promise, and a person who becomes careful. That's all. You trade every piece of evidence you have for the privilege of watching them get better at hiding it. I wasn't going to make her careful. I was going to make her comfortable. Thursday morning, I drove past 3 banks I've used for 20 years and went another 11 miles to a credit union in Marion where nobody knew my name, and I opened an account with $60. Friday, I called a woman named Ruth, who I'd once given expert testimony for on a retaining wall case, and asked her a hypothetical question about Ohio, and she said, "Eli, nobody asks me a hypothetical." I counted the seconds. 2.5. And Saturday, in the truck outside a hardware store, I took a receipt off the dash and wrote 2 lines on the back of it in blue pen. Then I threw it away. I wrote that note 30 or 40 times over the following months. Different receipts, different words, same 2 lines eventually. The first one was for her. The second one wasn't for her at all, and she'd never in a million years have guessed who it was for. Sunday morning, she asked if I'd take a look at the tax file, because there was something she wanted to move around before the quarterly. And when I opened it, I found the storage unit's first payment. March of the previous year, 3 days after we buried my father, the week she told me she was too sick with the flu to make the drive. 3 days. She'd stood at my father's graveside on a Wednesday with her hand flat between my shoulder blades, and by Saturday she was signing a lease on a storage unit 40 minutes from our house and calling it Studio Overflow. Except, and this is where I have to be honest with you about how these things actually work, that's not what the tax file said. Not exactly. What the tax file said was that the first payment cleared on the 22nd. The lease could have been signed any day that week. I put that in the right column with a question mark next to it because a question mark is a real thing and a conclusion isn't. That's the discipline. You want it to mean the worst thing. 99 times out of 100, it does. But the one time it doesn't will make a liar out of everything else you wrote. So I sat with the question mark. For a long time, that unit was the only thing in this whole story I couldn't explain, and I'll tell you plainly. I lost more sleep over that $89 a month than I did over the motel. Now here's what the next few months looked like from the outside. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I mowed the yard on Saturdays. I fixed the wobble in the newel post she'd been asking me about since Christmas. We went to her sister's for Easter and I carried the ham. In June, she got a big commission, a full gut on a lake house up near Hillsdale, and when she told me about it, she was so lit up she talked with her hands, and I told her she'd earned it, and I meant that too. And on Tuesdays and Thursdays between 12,040 and 35 I didn't check the app. Not once. I already had what I needed, and a man who keeps checking is a man who's going to slip and say something. Here's what I did instead, in the order I did it. First, I moved my consulting work into an LLC of my own. That sounds sinister. It wasn't. 2/3 of my income for 11 years has been contract work. Depositions, failure analysis, reports for insurance carriers, and I've been running all of it as a sole proprietor because I'd never gotten around to fixing it. My accountant, a blunt man named Marv who's told me the same thing every March since 2016, had been after me about it for years. So I finally did the thing he wanted. On paper, it was housekeeping. In practice, it meant that from June onward, every dollar I earned landed somewhere clean, separate, and documented from day one. Second, I stopped paying for things with the joint card and started paying cash for anything I didn't want to explain later. Not much. Full fee. A locksmith consult. 2 hours of a lawyer's time. Third, and this is the one that mattered, I started photographing the house. Every room. Every closet. The workshop, the loft, the crawl space, the shelf in the basement where 30 years of paint cans sit. I did it on a Sunday when she was at her sister's with a tape measure and half the shots for scale, and it took me 6 hours. Because I have watched, in courtrooms, 3 separate marriages come apart over the question of what was actually in the house. Not the house, the stuff, and the person with the photographs wins that argument every single time without ever raising their voice. Real quick, if you're getting something out of this, take a second and hit subscribe and give it a like. Costs you nothing, and it keeps stories like this one coming. All right. Where was I? July 11th, I got in the truck at 9 in the morning and I drove out to Ridgeway Self-Storage. It's exactly what you're picturing. Rows of roll-up doors the color of dried mustard, gravel drive, a chain-link fence with a code box, and an office with a window unit dripping onto the concrete. I didn't have the code. I didn't have the unit number. What I had was 11 years of testifying as an expert witness, which mostly teaches you one thing: people tell you the truth when you don't ask them for it. So I went into the office and I told the kid behind the counter, 22 maybe, with a fishing magazine open on the desk, that my wife rented a unit here and I was thinking about renting a second one for my tools. And did they have anything on the end row, because I hated backing a trailer. He asked what name it'd be under. I said Corinne, and I spelled the last name for him, and he typed it in. And he said, and I remember this exactly, "Oh, sure, C14. You want it close to hers?" I said no. I said I'd think about it, and I thanked him, and I walked out into that parking lot in 94-degree heat and stood there in front of unit C14 with a padlock on it that I had not put there and could not open. I drove home. I wrote C14 in the right column, and the question mark stayed. Now, August. And August is where the second curve starts. Corinne came home on a Thursday night and told me the Hillsdale Lake House had gone sideways. The clients had fired their contractor mid-project and wanted her to take over the whole build-out. Full scope. 6 figures, but she'd have to carry material costs herself for 90 days before the draw came through. She sat across from me at that island with her calculator app open and her hair pushed back, and she said, "I need to pull from the line of credit. We have a home equity line on Hollis Ridge. Opened it in 2018 to redo the roof and the septic. $240,000 available, and at that point we owed nothing on it. And here's the thing I want you to understand about me, because if you don't understand it, the rest of this looks like something it isn't." I said yes. I didn't say yes to trap her. I want that on the record. I looked at my wife of 26 years across a countertop she'd picked out herself, and I saw a woman who was genuinely excited about her own work for the first time in maybe 4 years, and some stubborn, stupid, 26-year-old part of me still wanted her to have it. What I did do was ask her to run it through her LLC properly, with a promissory note between the LLC and the household, because that's how Marv would want it for the taxes. She laughed at me. She said, "God, you're such a filing cabinet." And she signed it. $91,000, drawn on the equity line on August 22nd, papered as a loan from us to her business. In her handwriting, with her signature on it. I filed it. I didn't feel clever. I felt tired. Now I want your honest take on that, because people are going to disagree with me hard. Should I have said no? Should I have shut that line of credit down the second I read those messages? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you'd have done sitting on that stool. September and October, she was gone constantly. Hillsdale's an hour and 40 each way. She'd leave at 6 and get back at 9, and she was exhausted in a real way, and the Tuesday-Thursday window stopped mattering because every day was a Tuesday now. Owen came home the first weekend of October. 2 nights. He and I put a new float valve in the upstairs toilet, and he stood in that bathroom in his socks holding a flashlight for me, the way he did when he was 9, and he said, "You and Mom good?" I counted the seconds before I answered. 3.5. I heard it in my own mouth. I said we were fine, and my son, who spends his working life reading people in the worst 10 minutes of their lives, looked at me for a second longer than he needed to and then handed me the wrench. Halloween, she came in around 10 and sat down on the bottom stair to get her boots off, and she stayed there. She said, "Do you ever feel like you built something you can't live in?" I asked her what she meant. She said she didn't know. She said she was just tired and the Hillsdale kitchen was going to be beautiful, and she hated it. Then she went up to bed, and I sat down on that same stair and I understood something I had gotten completely wrong for 7 months. She wasn't happy. Whatever this was, it had never once made her happy. That was November 2nd. And on November 4th, the tablet in my workshop synced one last message before her account finally kicked it off for good, and it wasn't from him. It was from her to him, and it was 11 words long. "Don't be gentle with me. I need this to stay ugly." 11 words. Sent at 11,052 on a Tuesday night while I was downstairs putting the storm windows on. I read it wrong. I want to be upfront about that because I got a lot of things right in those months, and this one I got completely, catastrophically wrong. What I heard in that sentence was a woman who wanted the affair to stay cheap, who wanted it to stay a motel on Route 9 with a color TB sign, because cheap is easy to walk away from and kind is not. I thought she was protecting herself from feeling something real for him. That is not what she meant. Not even close. But it took me the better part of a year and a conference room table to find that out, so let me stay where I was. Because that same night, I did the one thing I had been avoiding for 4 months. The thread on that tablet never showed a name. Just a number. 10 digits, no contact card, nothing. And I had left it that way on purpose, the way you leave a wall unopened when you already know what's behind it and you're not ready to price the repair. I typed those 10 digits into my own phone's search bar. It came back in half a second. It was already in my contacts. Saved in September of 2009, in my own handwriting, so to speak, Wade, tile guy. Wade Tomlin, 6'4", 61 years old, laughs like a truck starting. He built the kitchen island. The one in the middle of our kitchen with the walnut top and the overhang Corinne fought him about for 2 weeks. He hauled that slab in on a Saturday in 2013, and Owen and I helped him carry it, and we drank beer out of the garage fridge afterward, and he told my son that the secret to a good joint is patience. He was at Owen's graduation party. He fixed the flashing over our back door in a rainstorm in 2016 and wouldn't take a dime for it. 12 years that man ate at my table. And I sat there in a dark kitchen with my phone lighting up my face, and I understood that I had helped carry the exact piece of furniture that I would eventually leave the note on. Look, if you're still riding along with me here, take 1 second and hit subscribe and drop a like on this. It helps the channel more than I can tell you. Alright. Thanksgiving that year was at our house. 14 people. Corinne's sister Deb brought 2 pies and an opinion about the turkey brine. Owen drove up from Cincinnati and slept 12 hours straight, and my wife set a table that people took pictures of before they'd sit down at it. I carved. I always carve. I've been carving that bird since 1998, and there's a specific knife and a specific order, and my father taught me both, and I did it that year the same as every other year, in the same shirt, with the same hand. And somewhere between the potatoes and the pie, Deb asked who we were going to get to look at the sag in the front porch, and Corinne said, without a flicker, without a breath, we'll have Wade come out. 14 people kept eating. I said that sounded good. I want to explain something about restraint, because I know how it looks from the outside. It looks like weakness. It looks like a man who doesn't have it in him. It isn't. Restraint is a load calculation. Every ounce of anger I let out of my mouth at that table was an ounce I'd have to explain later, in a room with a stenographer in it, to a woman I'd never met, who would decide what happened to a house with my son's height marked on the pantry door. So I carved the turkey. And I want to tell you honestly, the hardest thing I have ever done in my life was not leaving. It was passing that man's name down a table full of people I loved and saying sounds good. December. The Hillsdale draw came through on the 14th. $162,000 into her LLC account. The promissory note said the $91,000 came back to the household within 30 days of the draw. She didn't send it back. She came to me on the 19th with her calculator app open and said the clients wanted to extend into the boathouse and the guest cottage, and if she gave the 91 back now, she'd just have to draw it again in March, and wasn't that stupid? I said it was probably stupid, yes. I asked her to sign an amendment. She rolled her eyes and signed it. And that's it. That's the whole trap, and I want to be honest about what it was and what it wasn't. I never once tricked that woman. I never hid a document, never forged a line, never asked her for a thing that Marv wouldn't have asked for anyway. Every single page she signed, she read, and she signed it because she thought I was a filing cabinet, and filing cabinets don't have plans. Meanwhile, I'd been out to see Ruth twice more, in an office above a dry cleaner in Marion, paying cash, and she told me 2 things I did not want to hear. The first was that Ohio is a no-fault state and equitable distribution, and that a judge is not going to hand me a bigger share of a house because my wife spent 17 months at the Larkspur Inn. Adultery, legally speaking, is mostly just sad. It isn't leverage. The second thing she told me was the thing that changed everything. She said, "What moved the needle isn't what she did to you. It's what she did to the money. And you're the only one who can prove what the money did." I asked her how long a thing like this takes if it goes badly. She said 18 months, easy. 2 years, if there's a business in it. I counted the seconds before I answered her. Or, I could feel myself doing it. January, I did the boring, invisible work. I forwarded my mail to a box in Marion. I moved my consulting income to the credit union. I took out a small phone plan in my own name. I pulled 31 years of licenses, certifications, and continuing ed records out of the flat file in the workshop and copied every page. And on a Sunday afternoon in the first week of February, I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a hardware store on Route 9 with the engine running and a receipt in my hand, and I wrote the note for the last time. 2 lines. Blue pen. The first line said, "I know about the Larkspur Inn." The second line I'm going to keep for a while yet, because the second line is the whole story, and she had it in her hand at 60:40 in the morning on February the 11th, and she never once looked where it told her to look. I left on a Tuesday. I want you to know how ordinary it was. I got up at 4:30 like always. I made coffee. I put 2 duffel bags and a toolbox in the bed of the Tundra and covered them with a tarp. I watered the fig tree in the south window because it was Sunday's job, and Sunday I'd forgotten. Then I stood in the doorway of our bedroom in the dark for about a minute and a half and looked at my wife of 26 years sleeping with one arm off the side of the bed, and I did not wake her up, and I did not hate her. I set the note on the walnut island, square in the middle, where the light comes in, and I drove. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat, and I didn't touch it for 11 hours. When I finally turned it over that night in a motel outside Findlay, there were 41 missed calls from her. And 1 text message from a number I hadn't spoken to in 12 years. "Gay Tomlin." 3 words, "She's not okay." 3 words on a screen in a motel outside Findlay from a man whose hands built the island I'd left the note on. I didn't answer him. Not that night, not that month. I set the phone face down again, and I lay on top of a bedspread in my clothes and listened to a truck idle in the lot for 20 minutes. And I'll tell you what I kept turning over. Not "how dare he." Not any of that. What I kept turning over was that he'd said, "She's not okay," and not, "I'm sorry." 12 years at my table, and the first thing that man reached for wasn't his own defense. It was hers. Here's how a man disappears, in case you ever wondered. It's not dramatic. It's paperwork and a rented room. I took a furnished efficiency above a hearing aid clinic in Marion, $410 a month, month to month, with a window that looked at a parking garage I could have told you the failure points of from the sidewalk. I bought a folding table, a lamp, a coffee maker, and 1 mug. And then I went back to work. That's the part people don't expect. I had 3 open files, a stairwell in Toledo, a retaining wall down near Portsmouth, and a deposition scheduled for the 4th week of March that I had no intention of missing. I shaved. I wore the good shirt. I gave 4 hours of sworn testimony about anchor bolt corrosion, and I did not think about my wife one single time in those 4 hours, which was the first mercy I'd been handed in a year. Ruth filed on the 20th. Corinne was served at the house on a Thursday afternoon by a heavy-set man in a windbreaker who I'm told was very polite about it. The voicemails started that night. There were 19 of them over 5 days. I saved everyone, transcribed everyone, and dated everyone, because that is what I do, and because Ruth had told me flatly to never, ever delete a thing. The 7th one is the one I still hear. 2:14 in the morning. She wasn't crying. She'd gotten past crying and into that flat, sanded-down voice people get at 2 in the morning, and she said, "You didn't leave. You conducted an inspection, and then you condemned the building." And then, after a pause, I counted at 6 full seconds, "You left a riddle on my counter, Eli." Who does that? Who does that to somebody? She meant the second line. She'd read it 800 times by then, and she'd decided it was a cruelty. Some final, clever thing I'd left behind to make her feel stupid. It wasn't. It was the opposite of that. But I wasn't going to explain it to a voicemail box, and I wasn't going to explain it to her, because the whole point of that second line was that she had to walk to it on her own feet. Quick one, if this story's holding you, hit subscribe and give it a like before we go on. It takes 2 seconds, and it means a great deal. Now, the dissolving. And I want to be careful here because this is the part where people expect me to say I gutted her. I didn't. I filed. The joint card was closed and paid to zero out of my own account. I would not leave that woman with a balance she didn't know about. The equity line was frozen at its current draw, which the bank does automatically the moment a filing hits, and I want to be clear that I didn't ask them to. It's just what happens. My name came off the household utilities in April. My mail had been going to Marion since January. And the $91,000 sat there in the middle of it all like a slab on a driveway. Ruth sent one letter. Not a threat, a letter. It attached a promissory note signed in August, an amendment signed in December, and a one-page schedule showing the draw that came into her LLC on the 14th of that same month. It asked, in the driest language you have ever read, for the loan to be repaid to the marital estate per its own terms. Her attorney's response was that the funds had been reinvested into the boathouse and cottage phases and were not liquid. Which was true. And which was also, in the eyes of a court, $91,000 of marital money sitting inside a business she wanted to keep, a business she had spent 17 months telling another man she was building for herself. I didn't feel one thing when Ruth read me that response over the phone. I want to say I did. I sat on a folding chair in a rented room with one mug and I said, all right, and I hung up and I went out and bought a broom because the floor was filthy and I hadn't noticed until then. Wade called once. April 11th, a Saturday, 1840 in the morning. I let it go. The voicemail was 40 seconds long and it opened with, I've been waiting 12 years for you to knock on my door and you never did and I don't think you ever were going to. That's a strange thing to hear from the man who wrecked your life. I didn't understand it for a long time. He said one other thing before he hung up, that he told her it had to stop in November, and that she'd said something to him he wasn't going to repeat over a phone. I never called him back. He never called again. Whatever that man was carrying, he carried it. Let me ask you something here, because I've gone back and forth on it for years. Was I wrong not to pick up that phone? Some of you are going to say I owed him nothing, and some of you are going to say I owed myself the answer. Tell me honestly in the comments what you'd have done. June. Discovery. Discovery is where a marriage stops being a marriage and becomes a spreadsheet. Both sides list everything. Accounts, vehicles, retirement, business assets, debts, and this is the one, every recurring obligation over $50 a month. Which meant she had to disclose Unit C, 14. Ruth got the inventory on a Tuesday. She called me and said, Eli, I've got the storage unit contents here. Are you sitting down? And I said something short and stupid because I had spent 14 months with a question mark in the right-hand column and I already knew what was going to be in it. It was my father's house. Ogabit. His workbench. 9 boxes of his tools, each one labeled in her handwriting. The recliner. 2 milk crates of Motor Trend magazines going back to 1974. The tin cookie box with his Army discharge papers and my mother's rings in it. The pressure-treated birdhouse he built the summer before he got sick that I told the estate sale woman to just take with the rest. Because I did. The week we buried him, I stood in that garage and I told everybody to clear it out because I could not stand in a room full of that man's things and stay upright, and I called that being efficient. And 3 days later, my wife drove out to the county line and rented 800 square feet and paid $89 a month for 11 months of her own money to keep every last piece of him, and never told me because she knew I'd have made her get rid of it. I sat in that rented room and I put my hands over my face and I stayed like that for a while. That's what nobody prepares you for. It would be so much easier if she'd been a monster. I had built a right-hand column 14 months deep, every entry true, every entry provable, and one line of it turned out to be the single kindest thing anybody had ever done for me. Ruth called back that afternoon. Business voice. She said opposing counsel had come back with a supplemental request of their own, and she read it to me twice because she didn't understand it either. They wanted the folio and the full itemized charges for a hotel stay in Pittsburgh, March 14th of the previous year. Because I log my mileage. Because I keep every receipt, and every receipt goes into the tax file, and the tax file goes to both sides in Discovery. And somewhere in a lawyer's office, a woman with a highlighter had noticed that a man who documents everything had paid for 2 nights in a room he'd already checked out of, and Corinne wanted to know why. And the only honest answer to that question was sitting in a manila envelope behind a front desk in Pittsburgh where I had left it at 9:40 in the morning on the day she drove out to Route 9. I told Ruth to give it to them. She argued with me for 9 minutes. And Ruth does not argue, Ruth states, and then she waits for you to catch up. But she argued about this one because in her words, it was sympathetic and irrelevant, and sympathetic and irrelevant is the exact combination that costs people money in a settlement. I told her to produce it anyway. Full folio, itemized, and the item the folio was pointing at. Because here's the thing about the right-hand column. It only works if you never once decide what goes in it. The second you start choosing which true things to write down, you're not documenting anymore. You're arguing. And the whole reason I was going to walk out of this thing with my hands clean was that I had never, not one single time in 14 months, put a thumb on that scale. So, on a Wednesday in late June, Ruth's paralegal called the Hollander in Pittsburgh and asked whether they were still holding a sealed package under my name from March of the previous year. It had been in a hotel safe for 15 months. There was a $25 package hold fee on the folio, dated March 14th, 9:40 in the morning, which is the line item that started all of this, and which I had paid for and filed and forgotten about, because I file everything. Now I'll tell you what was in it. That January, a carrier out of Hartford had offered me a 5-year appointment to their National Failure Review Panel. Principal engineer. It was, without any exaggeration, the top of the ladder in my line of work, the thing you point at when somebody asks what you did with your life. $290,000 a year, and about 180 nights on the road. I'd already said yes. Verbally, in December, on a call I took standing in my own driveway because the reception's better out there. And then I spent 8 weeks watching my wife eat dinner across from me while looking at her phone. I didn't know about Wade. I want to be very clear, because this is the part people don't believe. I did not know one single thing. What I knew was that there was a hairline crack in something I'd been standing on for 26 years, and I had spent 31 years being paid to know that a hairline crack is never cosmetic. So, on the morning of March 14th, in a hotel business center that smelled like toner, I printed and signed 3 pages. The first with a letter declining the Hartford appointment. The second was my resignation from expert witness work altogether, effective at the close of my open files. And the third was a signed acceptance for a plans examiner position with the county building department, $61,000 a year, no travel, home every night by 5:30, health through the state. Less than a quarter of the money. 31 years of a career, folded up and handed back over a laminate counter. The front desk manager, a woman named Bev, notarized my signature at 9:40 and asked if I wanted her to mail it. I said no. I said, hold it in the safe, I'll be back Thursday. Because I wasn't going to tell my wife I'd done it. I was going to do the whole thing wrong, the way men my age do everything. Drive home 2 days early, take her to the Blue Cardinal on Route 9 on a Tuesday afternoon, and slide 3 pieces of paper across a diner table and let her read them herself. I got within 38 minutes of that diner. And her pin was already sitting on the other side of it. There was a 4th page in the envelope. Handwritten. Half a page, and I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but the first line of it was, I've been gone too long and I noticed. Noticed? That's what I wrote, 6 hours before a woman who'd made up her mind about me typed, he doesn't actually see them. If you're still with me here at the hard part, hit that subscribe and give this a like. It genuinely helps me keep telling these. Ruth produced all 4 pages on a Thursday. I found out later from a lawyer's assistant who probably shouldn't have told me that Corinne read them in a conference room in Delaware County with her attorney and a paralegal present. She got through the first 2 pages fine. She got to the county job with the $61,000 on it and she asked for a minute. Then she went out into the hallway and did not come back for 45. The next morning, her attorney withdrew the supplemental request. 2 days after that, they withdrew their opposition to the LLC valuation. 3 weeks after that, the $91,000 was acknowledged on paper as a marital receivable, and nobody fought about it again. July, the offers started coming across sensibly. August, we had a draft. By the first week of September, 2 people who had promised each other a whole life in a room with orange shag carpet had a 19-page document with almost nothing left to argue about. Almost. She wanted the house. Not wanted, needed in the way people need things when they've stopped being able to name what they've lost. She'd have given up the retirement. She offered to eat the entire 91. Her position, in writing, was that she would take on the full equity line, buy out my interest, and stay on Hollis Ridge Road. $612,000 of house, on a designer's income, with $240,000 of credit line hanging off the back of it like a porch nobody inspected. Ruth ran the numbers twice and told me flatly it was the best financial outcome I was going to get, and also that she'd rarely seen a worse decision made by an intelligent adult. I sat in that rented room above the hearing aid clinic with my one mug, and I thought about the pencil marks on the pantry door frame. That's the only thing I actually wanted out of that entire building. A piece of trim 4 feet long with a boy's whole childhood on it in graphite. I signed off on it. I asked for exactly one item in return, itemized on page 14, and her attorney called it the strangest schedule he'd ever attached to a divorce decree, contents of Unit C14, Ridgeway Self-Storage, in full. Nothing falls all at once. But when it finally goes, it goes on a Tuesday, and everybody standing there acts like it was sudden. Mediation was set for October the 14th. County Courthouse Annex, 3rd floor, Conference Room B. A retired judge named Halstead, 2 lawyers, 2 people who used to be married, and a table. The Friday before, Ruth called me at home. I'd moved by then, a rented 2-bedroom in Marion with a garage big enough to put my father's workbench back together in. She said opposing counsel had passed along a request. Off the record, before the session, no lawyers in the room. 10 minutes. Ruth's advice was 1 word long. She said, don't. She said there is no version of that room that helps you, and that people say things in those 10 minutes that end up in a transcript 8 months later. I counted the seconds before I answered her. No, I heard every one of them go by. And then I said yes. Not because I wanted an apology. I want you to understand that I had stopped needing one somewhere around June, in a rented room, with my hands over my face. I said yes because there was one thing in that entire 19-page document that still didn't have an answer, and it wasn't the money, and it wasn't the house, and it wasn't Wade Tomlin. It was that I had left 2 lines on a walnut island in February, and 8 months later, that woman still had no idea what the second one meant. Conference Room B has a window that doesn't open and a table too big for 4 people, let alone 2. She was already sitting when I came in. She'd lost maybe 15 pounds. She had a legal pad in front of her with nothing written on it and a paper cup of coffee she never touched once in 10 minutes. I didn't sit across from her. I sat at the corner, 1 chair over, because across is where you put a witness. She started before I got settled. She said she wasn't going to ask me for anything, and that if I wanted to leave when she was done, I should leave. Then she said, it started because I decided you'd already left. She told it in order. That's the thing that got me. She told it like a report. October, 2 years back. She'd finished a full gut on a house in Bexley, $140,000 of work, the best room she'd ever built, and the clients put it on the market 11 weeks later without ever moving in. And she sat in her car in that driveway and understood that everything she made for people who left it. She said she came home that night and told me about it, and I said, that's a shame, hun, and I asked what was for dinner. I don't remember that. I want to say I do. I've gone looking for it 100 times, and it isn't there. Wade came out to fix a shower pan the following Tuesday. And she said the reason she chose him, her word, chose, wasn't that he was kind or funny or anything else. It was that he was the only man she knew who would be easy to get caught with. She said, I wasn't trying to have an affair. I was trying to find out whether you'd notice, and then it turned out I could not stop finding out. 17 months of a test she kept failing on purpose. I asked her about December. about the driveway. She'd heard it. The whole call. She was standing at the kitchen window with a dish towel, and she heard me say yes to Hartford, 180 nights on the road, and she said she felt something close to relief because now she had it in writing. Now there was proof that the story she'd been telling herself since Bexley was true. She was a thing people finished and moved out of. And then she said the sentence I'd been carrying around wrong for a year and a half. She said, when I told him not to be gentle with me, I meant I needed it to stay something a person could deserve. Not protecting herself from him. Making sure that whatever happened to her afterward, she'd earned it. I want to say something here because I'd had a lot of people tell me since then that she was building an excuse in that room. She wasn't. I watched her the whole 10 minutes and she never once reached for me. She never said, if you'd only... When I asked her why she didn't just say any of it out loud in 2019, she took 4 seconds. I counted and she said, because you'd have fixed it. And I didn't think I was worth the repair. Before I tell you how it ended, I want your honest opinion on that, because it split every person I've ever told this to. Is that a reason, or is it just a better-sounding excuse? Tell me in the comments. I still don't know. Then she made her offer. She said she'd withdraw the buyout. List the house in the spring, take whatever it brought, pay the $91 back in full, and she'd rent something small. She said she'd been sleeping in the guest room since March because she couldn't do the master. And then she asked, no lawyer, no paper, just a woman at a table, whether there was any version where she got to try. And here's what I need you to understand. I thought about it. I'm 54 years old, and I had a folding table and 1 mug, and across from me was the woman who wrapped a fig tree in a moving blanket during an ice storm, and I thought about it for a real long minute. Quick thing before the last of it. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe and give it a like. That's the whole ask, and it means more than you know. What I said was that I had 1 question, and then I'd give her an answer. I asked her what she thought the second line meant. She laughed. Not a good laugh. She said she'd read it 400 times. She'd decided it was a chore list. She'd decided it was contempt. She'd decided at 2 in the morning more than once that it was a code, that there was some account or a safe deposit box or a woman's name hidden in it. So I told her. The second line said, Owen, the pantry casing comes off with a putty knife, not a pry bar. It was never for her. I knew that when I wrote it, and I knew it when I set it down on that island. It was 4 feet of pine trim on a door frame with a boy's height marked on it in graphite going back to 1994, and it was the only thing in $612,000 of house that I actually wanted. I couldn't take it that morning. You can't pull a casing at 4:30 in the dark without waking somebody up. So I left instructions for my son on how to take it out without splintering it. Because I knew whatever happened next, one of us would be back for it, and I wanted it to come off clean. She went the color of the table. And then she told me, in her own words, in a room with no lawyers in it, what she had done in June, the month she decided she was keeping the house. She brought in a crew to refresh the interior for the appraisal. New paint through the main floor. New hardware. And new casings and baseboard on the whole first level, because the old pine was dented and dinged and it was costing her real money on the comp. 32 years of my son's growing up went into a roll-off dumpster in the driveway to make the house appraise $11,000 higher so she could afford to keep it. She said, I didn't know. And she was telling the truth. She had it in her hand in February, on a hardware store receipt, in blue pen, and she read it 400 times and never once saw what it was. He measures things. He doesn't actually see them. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then the lawyers came in at 10 after 9, and we signed a 19-page document, and she kept the house, and I got 9 boxes of my father's tools out of Unit C14. That was 22 months ago. The workbench is in my garage in Marion. Owen came up over Memorial Day, and we put the birdhouse on a cedar post out back, and it's crooked, and I'm leaving it crooked. He's engaged now to a nurse named Priya who takes her coffee blacker than I do. I'm a plans examiner for the county. Home by 5:30. $61,000 a year, and I have never once missed a dinner I said I'd be at. I drove down Hollis Ridge Road one time, this past March, because a job took me within 4 miles of it, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't choose that route. The house is immaculate. Boxwood squared off, gutters clean, the porch she never got weighed out to fix now sitting straight and painted. It's the best looking house on that street. Every window dark except the one over the sink. And in the south window, where the light comes in for 4 hours in February, there's a fig tree with nothing on it. Bare gray sticks in a pot she has not moved and will not throw out. Deb still calls me at Christmas. She says her sister keeps that place like a museum. Nobody eats in the kitchen. Nobody sits on the furniture. I've spent 31 years telling people that nothing falls all at once, that it's always a hairline crack, somebody looked straight at and called cosmetic. What took me until 56 to learn is that nothing gets rebuilt all at once either. It's a workbench in a garage. A crooked birdhouse. A sun on a Sunday. You don't get to move back into the thing you burned down, no matter how beautiful you keep the ashes, but you are allowed, if you're patient, to start pouring a new footing somewhere else. If this story stayed with you, and you'd like to hear more true-to-life stories of secrets, betrayal, and quiet justice, tap the video on your screen now. I'll be waiting for you there.